Thank you very much indeed, Natalie. Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us. My name's Toby Lowe. I'm a professor of public management at Manchester Metropolitan University at the Centre for Public Impact and at CiviNet Associates. And I'm going to talk to you today about human learning systems as a vision of radical pragmatism for public management. So this talk is about public service and public management, and here's what I mean by those terms. So public service is purposeful work that enables people to create good outcomes in their lives. And public management is how public service is organised, funded and governed. So the crucial point of this definition is that public service isn't just done by the public sector. So public service is undertaken by a wide range of people and organisations who want to create the conditions where everyone can lead thriving lives. And I'm going to offer you a choice about how you do public management. And I'm going to argue that this choice is really significant because I think that the research evidence and our experience tells us that the way we mostly do public management at the moment actively gets in the way of providing effective public service. And so the point is, we can choose to do this differently if we want to. And in offering this choice, I want to offer you some hope that things can be better, and then we can all play a role in making them so. And this is the essence of that choice. It's a choice about the way we think public service is most effectively organised. Do we liberate people, both citizens and the workers who serve them, and enable them to learn what works in their contexts? Or should we try and control people, that's both citizens and workers, and make them comply with our understanding of best practice? And so what are the different public management paradigms which underpin this choice? So behind door number one is human learning systems. So this is public service for human freedom and flourishing. And what it means is liberated and learning citizens, so people supported to pursue what matters to them, liberated and learning workers who have the freedom to learn what works for each and every person they support, and liberated and learning leaders who are creating the conditions for citizens and workers to continuously learn together. I'll expand on what I mean by those ideas later. But this is, in essence, this is about public service which moves from central control to citizen control. And as you'll see, there's a lot of liberating and learning here. But public service is all about what we do for each other, yeah? So in this version of public service, what is it that connects us? It's relationships which bind us together. So we do the right thing by citizens, by George or by Hardeep, because we recognise them as another human being with strengths and needs that we can respond to. And human learning systems, because it stems from complexity and systems thinking traditions, uses the language of systems to describe these relationships. So what we mean by a system is a set of relationships which make something happen in the world. And a system is just a mental model of a set of these relationships. And we create these mental models to identify the relationships that we care about in respect of achieving a particular purpose. So the language and concepts of systems is an attempt to get us to think rigorously about how our relationships work. And the language of systems can seem cold and impersonal sometimes. And if that's the reaction you get, try thinking relationships when you hear the word system. So that's door number one. Behind door number two is public choice theory and new public management. And so where does that framing around control and compliance come from? Well, its intellectual origins come from James Buchanan. He was an American libertarian economist in the 60s. And for those who are interested, I highly recommend his biography, Democracy in Chains. So he was the first person that the Koch brothers invested in as what became later part of Project 2025. His mission was to break the welfare state, because as a libertarian, he believed that it's illegitimate to tax one person and spend those resources on someone else. So he created a vision for the state and for public service that he called public choice theory. In his essence, he said that public servants, like everyone else, are selfish. So public servants can't be trusted to work in the public good. So they need to be controlled in order to make them serve the public good. How can public servants be controlled? This is where new public management comes in, which was built on the intellectual foundations of public choice theory. So we control public servants to make them do the right thing by the use of targets and by the discipline of the market. So where we contract to deliver particular specifications and we are bound by the service of that the terms of that contract. So doing the right thing in this vision means hitting our targets and living up to the terms of our contracts. And when we live inside this vision of public service, we create a situation in which workers are looking upwards for permission, for budgets, for reassurance they won't get into trouble. So when we organise for control, then compliance becomes the overriding virtue and capability. So how do we choose between these different public service paradigms? So this is partly a values choice. What do we want the world to be like? But it's also a pragmatic choice. How does the world actually work? And so let's use the definition of public service we identified earlier to help us make this choice. So let's check in. Do we believe that the purpose of public service is to help people create good outcomes in their lives? Feels like a fairly uncontroversial statement now, right? So, but if we do, then how outcomes are created becomes really significant, because knowing that can help us identify which public management paradigm enables that purpose. This is New Public Management's answer to how outcomes are created. It's a program logic model. Many of you will be really familiar with this. So it's a linear, disaggregated process by which organizations or programs deliver outcomes. It starts with a set of input resources, people and things, and they undertake program activity, which creates outputs, which creates outcomes. This is an alternative. This is a complex systems framing, this is the systems map of the outcome of obesity. A bunch of you will have seen me present this before. It's produced by the UK Government Office for Science in 2007. And this work suggests that there are 108 different factors which combine to create the outcome of obesity or its absence. And you can see them summed up into areas such as people's early life experiences, food production and supply, education, media, technology, the nature of work, the built environment, and healthcare and treatment options. So it's this whole system, all of these relationships operating interdependently are what creates the outcome of obesity or its absence. So, question one that I want to pose you. Which framing is a more accurate representation of the processes by which outcomes are created in the world? Because the answer to this question is really important. Because if outcomes are made from linear disaggregated processes like New Public Management says, then we can, maybe should, control people if what we really care about is outcomes. Because if outcomes are made like this, then we can use evidence to find best practice. And we can make workers and citizens comply with that best practice by setting performance targets which embody those practices and by sanctioning citizens to make them behave in desirable ways. And we can purchase outcomes by specifying what we want and putting those specifications out to tender. And we can hold organisations to account for delivering them. But if outcomes are created by complex systems, then we can't do any of those things. Because if an outcome is made by a complex system, then it's created by hundreds of different factors acting interdependently and unpredictably, most of which aren't anything to do with public service. So, and if it's a complex system, what works for one person won't necessarily work for another. And what works at one point in time won't necessarily work if we try it again. So we can't fund organisations to deliver outcomes because those organisations aren't in control of the factors by which outcomes are made. So if outcomes are complex, we can't control people to create good outcomes. Instead, we need to enable them to explore and learn for themselves what works uniquely in their context. So that was question one. Question two, who gets to decide what counts as a good outcome? Do some get to decide on behalf of others? Or does each person get to decide what counts as a good outcome for them? Because if some get to decide on behalf of others, then we can set standardized outcome targets, which will apply to everyone. And we can use those standardized metrics to benchmark between teams or places and reward or punish based on who achieves them best. But if each person gets to decide what matters to them, we can't use standardized metrics to judge performance, because what counts as good will be unique in each and every case. So I think we can frame the choice like this. If outcomes are simple and deliverable, and it's okay for one set of people to decide what those outcomes are on behalf of others, then we can control people and make them comply with best practice. But if outcomes are complex, and it matters that each person gets to decide for themselves what a good outcome is, then the most effective organisational strategy is to liberate people and enable them to learn together. So I think we can confirm these hypotheses by checking in with the evidence. So let's make this real. Let's make this properly pragmatic. What happens if outcomes are complex, but we choose to manage by control? Because this is essentially what I think we've been doing for much of the last 40 years. We've created a managerialist fantasy based on the idea that human flourishing is simple and that we can control public servants effectively to get it. So we've broken human flourishing outcomes down into discrete public services. This is the service that will help you find a job. This one will help you if you want to be a better parent. This one will help you if your mind is sick. This one will help you if this bit of your body is sick. Oh, no, not that bit of your body. That bit of your body is the service down the hall. And in this disaggregated managerialist fantasy, we pretend that if each service follows pathway A reliably enough, consistently enough, and with enough fidelity to the model, we'll get outcome B. Now, it would be great if this were true, but it's not. It's pretend. It's pretending to make the task of management easier. It's got nothing to do with the complex reality of people's lives. How do we know this? Meet Brian. So a while back, Brian was a train driver, and then someone jumped in front of his train and his life went into a bit of a spiral. So he developed mental health problems, substance use problems, lost his home and his relationships. So a bunch of the challenges that anyone can experience in their lives. And he ended up as the most frequent attender of accident emergency in Gateshead in 2022. And for those from other parts of the world, Gateshead is a town in northeast of England. And so there he encountered a program called Changing Futures Northumbria, who are one of our examples you'll hear from today. They began to work with Brian, and they asked him about his history of interaction with public service. And this is what they found. So this is a map of Brian's public service interaction over the past 10 years. And each of those little yellow bubbles is a contact with public service. So it really recorded every time he attended accident emergency or saw his drug and alcohol worker or was arrested or. So, and for the first time, we're able to see all of those interactions across all of those different public services. And this adds up to over 3,300 known contacts with public service over 10 years. There are bound to be more, which are unknown, which are unrecorded. And because we can put a precise cost on each of those interactions, we can work out exactly how much public service resource Brian used over the last 10 years. That was nearly £2 million. Nearly £2 million we spent supporting Brian. Now, if that was helping Brian, if that's what he needed, that would be money well spent. That would be exactly the right thing to do. But all of those interactions aren't helping. His life was getting worse, not better. By 2022, he couldn't maintain a tenancy. His substance misuse problems were more serious. He was in accident emergency over 50 times. And we can see, look at his public service use year on year. He's using more and more public service, and his life is getting worse. Just about the best we can say is we're just about keeping Brian alive, just about. But as he said himself, that wouldn't have been for long. So we've spent £2 million not helping Brian. But every one of those services was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, according to new public management. Every single one of them was compliant with its service specifications. None of those workers were doing anything wrong, according to their targets. Some of those services were in fact rated excellent by the inspectors. It's not just the particular experience of citizens that shows us that seeking to control via targets fails. The management research evidence tells us that seeking control via targets leads to routine pretending. So this is one of the joys of being a public management professor, right? We get to engage with this stuff. So this is just one of the pieces of evidence which should see us bury new public management. But it's a really, really significant one because it's a systematic review of all of the research studies into the use of target-based performance management across public, private and voluntary sectors for the last 40 years. What did it find? Over 80% of those studies find evidence of gaming, so the deliberate manipulation of data to make it look good. Nearly 3/4 of those studies find evidence of people deliberately lying. Let's stop and take a minute to really appreciate the significance of this evidence. Because what it's telling us is if we use targets to manage our services, we can't trust the performance data that is produced. It's likely to have been gamed in some way. So it may be that your cognitive dissonance kicks in hard at this point, right? Oh, hang on, that's not true of my service. But try to fight back against that cognitive dissonance. Think of all the ways in which the work, the people that you do is shaped to produce good-looking, compliant data, rather than serving the real strengths and needs of people like Brian. Because this is the cost of all of that pretending. We're not helping Brian. And maddeningly, we're wasting huge amounts of scarce resource not helping Brian. £2 million to make his life worse. And we're making it much harder to learn and improve. Because if we can't trust our data, we're not telling each other the truth. And if we're not telling the truth to each other, how does any of this get any better? And perhaps most insidiously, it means we're undermining public trust in government and public service. Because when the performance data that's published doesn't match people's own experience of public service, citizens feel that misalignment deeply. And that misalignment undermines trust, and it fosters the conditions in which extremism thrives. So we would say, let's choose to embrace the complex reality of how outcomes are actually made. We can do that by learning from those who have been experimenting with doing public management differently. So what I can share with you today is learning from those who have made this different choice. Because there are 72 organisations and places around the world who've been exploring how to do public management differently. And between them, they've written over 80 case studies of their work. Actually, there's many more than this, because these are just the people who've written up and shared their work. There are lots who haven't yet. So in this round of action research, just this last 2 years, there are 35 new examples. And what I'm going to share with you today is just a fraction of the knowledge that we've gained from all of this. If you're curious to find out more, I urge you to download the detailed insights reports that Natalie was referring to and engage with each of these different examples of practice. And this is essentially kind of one of the headlines we've learned from the work, that people are reorganizing each of these public management areas around learning. And so what we've learned is, in order to make these changes sustainable, for genuine paradigm shift to occur, it requires people making change in all of these areas together, so that all of these different areas have learning relationships at their core. So learning in public facing practice, learning in operational management, learning in leadership, learning in resource allocation, learning in governance and accountability, and learning in learning and evaluation. And yes, change in all of these areas is required to make sustainable, sticky change. And that sounds like it's a huge challenge, but the great news is you can start anywhere. You don't have to change all of these all at once. You can start somewhere and go everywhere. And you can make a bunch of these changes tomorrow. If you're a public-facing worker, you can have different conversations with the people you serve. If you're a team leader, you can organise your team meetings as learning environments. So let's dig into each of these kind of areas in turn. So this is how people have changed the public-facing work to organise around learning relationships. Principles are that citizens get to determine for themselves what counts as good outcomes for them with the support of workers, because what this needs is relational working, so that workers and citizens can deeply understand each other's strengths and needs. And what this enables is bespoke provision, so that public service can respond to the unique strengths and needs of each person. So what does this look like? What does it look like in practice? It means continuous collaborative experimentation and learning is the public-facing work. It means that every act of public service is an act of shared action research between worker and citizen. So them saying, let's explore together what works for you, because this is how real outcomes are made. How real outcomes are made in complex environments, in the complex realities of people's lives. So to do that, the roles of public-facing workers can be framed by this kind of learning cycle. So this is the pattern that we've seen across a range of different places. So let's go into this learning cycle. Let's say I'm a public-facing worker with responsibility to help you with your chronic pain. My first task is to help us both understand your life as a unique, complex system that's currently producing the outcome of chronic pain. So I might ask you questions like, what was going on for you when the pain started? Can you tell me more about the days when you notice your pain more? And together, we'll build up a picture of your life as a system that's creating the experience of chronic pain. And then together, we'll explore what actions we should take to see if we can create a version of your life as a system where your pain is manageable and you're having a fulfilling life. So we might say, what happens if we try this physiotherapy manipulation? What happens if we try this pain medication? What happens if you try joining this walking group? What happens if you try fitting this enablement equipment, et cetera, et cetera? And we'll treat each of those actions as pieces of action research. We'll decide on what data we need to capture to understand how those actions are going, and we'll make sense of that data together. And then what we'll do is we'll undertake those experiments and explorations. Make my slide work. And from what we learn from those, we'll embed behavioral change and structural change in and around your life and share that learning with anyone else who needs to do it. And because then we've made changes in your life as a system, then the cycle starts again. So this is what it means to move public service out of this delivery mindset, where public service is something that we deliver to people, and instead move every act of public service into an act of action research. And so if workers are continually experimenting, exploring, they can't be controlled via output or outcome targets because they have to be free to explore what works for each person they serve uniquely. So what does managers do? What do managers do if they're not setting targets and monitoring performance in this way? What they do is they organise the capacity to learn and improve. And we call this learning as a management strategy. So what it does is it changes the purpose and focus of management so that organising for continuous collaborative learning becomes the primary role of managers. So, and this happens at multiple scales in the public facing work, like we've just seen, at team scale, at organisational scale, at place scale, at country scale. At every level, the purpose and focus of management changes. What happens is that managers create connected learning cycles across those different system scales. So this is an example of learning cycles at the person scale that we were just talking about, connected to the team scale. So let's say I'm a team leader. I'm supporting a team of workers who are helping people with their chronic pain. And let's say there are 10 workers in this team, so who are each seeing 10 citizens at any one time. So that's 10 workers, 10 citizens. That's 100 learning cycles that my team are running simultaneously. So my primary job as a team leader is to create a learning environment, the processes and culture by which we can continuously learn from these learning cycles. So our team meetings can become debrief sessions in which we're sharing what's happening with our learning cycles. And we can ask questions like, okay, what are the patterns of need that we're seeing from all of this action research we're doing? What is our practice in response to that need? And how is our practice working? In that case, what are the staff capabilities that we need to recruit and train for? How should we organise ourselves in order to make this work better? And those questions inspire the learning cycles that I create as a team leader, experimenting with how to organise the work differently in response to the constant challenges to business as usual, which all of these processes of experimentation are creating. And in doing so, running my learning cycles, they're creating enabling conditions for the work to work. So what are leaders doing? If workers and managers are continuously learning and improving, they're looking after the health of the systems which create or frustrate the outcomes we seek to enable them to learn well. And I don't just mean leadership here as a seniority thing. This is about anyone who has leadership responsibility. And we call what they're doing system stewardship, the act of convening people and organisations to create a system of interest. And then stewarding those people and organisations so that they can understand themselves as a whole, so that they can see the relationships which create or frustrate that purpose, and are able to collaboratively change how those relationships operate. So the learning cycle is a process by which to achieve that. So it's a quasi-process map which stewards can use to create a healthy system. And we think a healthy system means one in which the people cultivate trust, obviously that they learn together, that they address power inequalities so that they can hear all of the diverse voices that are parts of that system. And a key point to remember here is this act of stewardship of creating and running learning cycles happens at all of the scales we've been talking about. Because all of those scales, person, team, organisation, place, country, they're all systems. They are all sets of relationships which matter in order to create outcomes. So the question for leaders becomes, can you steward diverse actors around a learning cycle? Can you build the capabilities across all of the actors in a system of interest to participate in learning cycles? And to create these healthy learning systems, the people and organisations involved must be funded to continuously experiment and learn. So what we're doing is changing how the money works. So what this looks like is funding for continuous collaborative experimentation and learning. It's funding to enable learning cycles. So one example of this is the Swedish International Development Agency. They contracted Climate Kick to create a systems innovation and experimentation fund, which they built around a learning cycle. So the grant application process tested the work that applicants had done to understand the system they wanted to change. And then they supported actors in those systems to design action research activity to explore actions to create change. And then what they funded was those pieces of action research. So they weren't funding the delivery of programs, they were funding organizations to experiment and learn collaboratively in their context, because that's how outcomes are made. And those processes are really, that as a funding process is really similar to those developed by UK public service commissioners at local scales. So the places and organisations you see there have funded so as to enable organisations to experiment and learn together. Because if we don't fund for learning, we don't create healthy systems and we don't get the outcomes we desire. So remember, if you're a funder and you try to fund for quote unquote results, or to purchase outcomes, you don't get real outcomes. You get a bunch of game data. So there's a really simple choice for funders. Do you want to fund in a way which supports the creation of real outcomes in the complex reality of people's lives? Or do you want a bunch of good-looking outcome or impact data? And you have to choose. You have to choose. Because as soon as you fund to purchase results, the data will likely be corrupted. Because remember, that's what the evidence says. And the great thing about this choice is it is a choice that any funder gets to make. So it is entirely in your gift if you want to fund in this way. And so then, if we work, manage, lead, and allocate resources for learning, we also need to govern for learning. So people are changing how governance and accountability works. So people are seeking to govern the health of the system. So the governance question they're essentially asking is, does this system have good learning processes and relationships? And alongside that, they're changing how accountability works. So they're making accountability for the appropriateness and rigor of learning and the adaptation from that learning. And they're changing who workers are accountable to. They're asking workers to account to citizens and peers as well as up the hierarchy. And they're changing how those accounts are made. So it's more about providing an account of what you've been doing using mixed methods. It's not just about counting. And if learning becomes the work, then evaluation serves a different purpose. So when learning is everyone's job every day, learning isn't a separate specialist function. So evaluation becomes evaluative practice. And the question that evaluation asks is, how can we support learning in the work every day? And there's a really important point here about data and learning, because some people hear the critique that we offer of targets and say that human learning systems therefore doesn't value data or measurement. Really happy to correct this misunderstanding, because data is more important to a human learning systems approach, not less. Because what human learning systems does is it breaks the link between data and targets, because as we've seen, targets corrupt data. They prevent it from doing its job. And we've known this since the 70s. So this is from Charles Goodhart, President of the Bank of England in the UK. Then when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So we break that link and enable data to do its job in supporting learning cycles, helping actors to understand their systems and helping to capture how the action research is going. Finally, what happens when we work like this? So let's engage with the ultimate pragmatic question. How much does it cost? To do that, let's check back in with Brian. And when Changing Futures Northumbria started working in a way that supported human freedom and flourishing, two things happened. Firstly, Brian's life dramatically improved. So now he has his own place. He's not just attending AA meetings, he's chairing them. He has a job. Secondly, his resource consumption has plummeted. So it's gone from over £460,000 a year in 2022 to less than £2,000 a year this year. And that's in the space of 18 months. So he's now using 0.3% of the resource he was using in 2022. The Changing Futures in Northumbria evaluation identified that they were creating an average cost saving of £50,000 per citizen per year, which is a really interesting figure because it exactly matches Thurrock's experiences of working in a similar way with a similar set of citizens, those with multiple and complex needs. I don't know that expression, but you get what I mean. So this is the results from Thurrock's complex housing intervention programme. an average cost saving of £50,000 per citizen per year, and a total of £1 million of cost avoidance for that programme as a whole. And if we multiply that cost saving figure for all the people in England with multiple and complex needs, according to UK government figures, we get a cost saving of £18 billion. And the equivalent figure for Scotland is 1.4 billion. And if we look at the figures for people with any complex challenge in the UK as a whole, then that cost saving we would get is £37 billion. This is what we can get simply by choosing to do public management differently. And note, those figures don't include any of the longer term cost savings from preventing people from developing the biggest and most complex problems that we get by working this way. This is the immediate cost of avoidance we can generate right now just by doing public management differently. So this is why human learning systems asserts that the purpose of public service is human freedom and flourishing. Because this represents and manifests a set of values in the world. It's what we believe is important about the world. And we think it's important to stand up for human freedom and flourishing right now, because when the world is becoming more authoritarian, we think it's time for this kind of radicalism and this kind of boldness. But the really fantastic thing about these values is that they're also fundamentally pragmatic in public management. Liberated people, connected in learning and relationships, is what enables us to create good outcomes in the complex reality of the world. And in doing so, we can save enormous amounts of public service resource when these things are tight. So this is a choice we all get to make, and it's a choice we can start doing tomorrow. So hopefully that has excited your curiosity just a little bit. And if you are curious, here are some things that you can do. So you can download the Insight series reports. You can check out the examples of practice which inspire you and connect with those people. You can begin to experiment with working in this way, because there's a free practical guide commissioned by Healthcare Improvement Scotland. Download it, get cracking. And if you feel like your organisation needs help with this exploration, you can ask for help from a learning partner. There's lots of people and organisations in the Human Learning Systems Collaborative who can help. And finally, if you like, you can get in touch with me, because I'd love to hear about what you're up to in this space, and my email address is there. So thank you for listening, folks. I hope that was interesting in some way.